So have you ever run from God? You've had God's calling on your life, and it's clear to you, and your response is not, yes, God, that's a great idea. Yes, God, I want to follow you. But more like Jonah. God says, go to Nineveh. Jonah goes where? Completely in the opposite direction. I think we've all had that to some extent. But we're going to look at today Matthew, Levi, a man who is really subtly on the run from the Lord's call on his life. He is, much like Jonah, his map, his life is laid out for him as soon as he is born. And Matthew's response is to run in the complete opposite direction. The Gospel of Matthew is written by Matthew. Levi is his original name. Can you imagine the Lord telling you to sit down and write in the Bible that's going to survive for all eternity your own testimony? It's got to be cool and somewhat nerve-wracking at the same time. Maybe think, though, and I've observed this in my life, sometimes we can get really caught up in the doctrines and the presentations and how to reach people for Jesus, when often the greatest testimony, the greatest information we can give to someone is simply, I was here, this is what Jesus did to me, for me. This is how he saved me. God took Matthew, made him write down his own story, it's in the other Gospels as well, for our benefit. If you guys are ever challenged, if you're dealing with someone that you would like to get to Christ, and you just don't know what to say, it's worthwhile just to say, here, I was lost, now I'm found. This is how it happened. Don't discount your own testimony. But we're dealing with Matthew, and he is the tax collector. That is how he is defined. As Christians, we've probably all dealt with the idea of a tax collector before, and we know that there's a negative connotation with them. Even now, the IRS is probably not our favorite group of people. But even if we've dealt with it before, it's easy to underrate how badly these people were viewed in this society. The tax collectors, the publicans, they were viewed as not only the people who were taking your money, they were viewed as thieves and crooks. They were also viewed as traitors and idolaters. They were the lowest of the low in society. And this is going to be Jesus saving a tax collector. That God includes this in his book is not an accident. A tax collector would be the equivalent in your mind if you think this person can never be saved. Who's the worst person, the worst group you can think of? Maybe a drug dealer now? Someone who's making pornographic films? Someone, maybe a member of a terror group across the world. That's the equivalent of a tax collector to the Jewish audience, because they viewed them as first crooks. The Roman system for tax collecting, they would rely on local people. They had this vast empire, and they would hire people by an auction system. Essentially, they'd go into Israel, they'd break up the area into sections, and then they would auction off each section to a certain person that would say, I will pay you this much per month or per year in tax revenues if you let me be the chief tax collector for that area. The Romans say, okay, you've got a deal. The tax collector was then free to collect as much as they wanted. They can collect $10, they can collect $1,000. It was completely up to them. They were given free rein. Now, what naturally happens in that situation is a person who is given free rein to collect money, as much money as they want from other people. Do you think they're going to take exactly the right amount of taxes? No, it doesn't make them any money. And then the natural inclination of people comes in, and they start by taking $100. And then the next year it's $1,000. The next year it's $10,000. They were crooks. They were thieves. They would tax everything that they possibly could in their region to get as much money as they could. So roads, if you rode on a road, you had to pay the tax collector. If you crossed a bridge, you had to pay the tax collector. If you used a market, you had to pay the tax collector. And this was all going to Matthew. Can you imagine crossing a bridge and have them paying it whole? Madness. They had the power of the Roman legions behind them. If you did not pay your taxes, let's bring in Claudius, the Roman legionnaire, to beat you up, to take your farm, to take your goods. They were notoriously oppressive and took your stuff. And that's just one aspect of the tax collector. They also were on the side of Rome. Rome was the country, the empire, that had destroyed the Jewish kings, that had taken over the country, that had killed thousands. And the tax collector, the Jewish man who chose to be a tax collector, chose to side with the enemy. It would be like World War II, if in the countries that Germany took over, they had people who collaborated with the Nazis, who said, because I want to make money, I'm going to side with Adolf Hitler and that gang against my country. That's what a tax collector was. He's a bad guy according to everyone. If we had a group here and we asked the same question back to early Jewish times, to this time, if you polled everyone would say, tax collector, good guy, bad guy. Bad guy, clearly. They're traitors. They stole this amount from me. I only owed $10 in taxes. They charged me $1,000. They were also viewed as idolaters because of the first two reasons. It was so obvious that tax collectors were bad guys. If you made that decision to be a tax collector, it was viewed by the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, that your money was your God. You had sold out so completely that all you cared about was money. So they were viewed as worshiping money as a god. What does Jesus say in Matthew chapter 6? You can't worship mammon, money, and God. It's impossible to worship the two because you'll love one and you'll hate the other. And this was true for the tax collectors too. They didn't even make any bones about the fact that they were choosing money over Israel. They were choosing money over their people. They were choosing money over fitting in with the rest of the Jewish people. Because as soon as they chose tax collecting, everyone around them hated them. They knew that was the cost, and they did it anyway. Tax collectors were not allowed to testify in court. They were considered inherently unreliable, and they were liars. They were not allowed to give money to the poor box, even at the temple, because the money was tainted by them. They were not allowed to offer sacrifices at the temple because they were idolaters. They were excluded from everything. And this is where Matthew finds himself at the beginning of our story, our account. He's crooked He's aligned with Rome, the Gentiles who worship false gods, and he's an idolater. The interesting thing, though, is over in Luke, for example, the introduction includes an interesting fact. It says, after these things, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." Matthew's original name was Levi. It's probably familiar to you because it's one of the original tribes, and they became the Levites. His name, Levi, indicates that he was of the tribe of Levi. He was a Levite. They made up the priests and the servants of God's temple. If you remember your Jewish history, your Old Testament, when the Promised Land was divided, you had the tribes each given areas of the Promised Land as their inheritance. They were supposed to be there, live there, tend that area, except the Levites. The Levites were set aside to act only for God. They had their own cities. They didn't possess land. And they took turns going to the temple and serving as the intermediary between God and man. If you were born a Levite, that means that you were chosen, your lottery, not random though, by God. Your life would stand for God. God chose him for his service. His dad would have been a priest. His grandfather would have been a priest. His great-grandfather would have been a priest. That is what his life was meant to be. But where do we find Levi at the beginning of our account? He's sitting in a tax collector's booth, acting as a tax collector. He is about as far as you can get from where God wanted him, God chose him to be. And there's no further place you can be. He's supposed to be in Jerusalem serving the temple, serving God, helping God's people do their sacrifices to God. Instead, he's stealing from people. He's worshiping money. He's chosen money over God. And what's more, he's in Capernaum, which is way in the north of Israel. Jerusalem's down here. He chose to bid on the district that is about as far away from Jerusalem, from where God is, from God's house, as you possibly could be. Isn't that interesting? He's running from God just like Jonah did. Jonah, go that way. God, I'm going to go that way. With Jonah, we know that he hated the Ninevites. He did not want them to be saved. With Matthew, it's really interesting if you think about it. Because he grows up amongst priests, amongst the religious leaders, amongst the high priest in the families that are serving God. But what is the problem during this whole period of time? The high priest has sold out, and he is a hypocrite, robbing from the people. Most of the priests have sold out, and they're saying they're serving God, but they're robbing from the people. The Jewish religious system had gotten so corrupt that the high priest is making $3 million per year off of people. From the Gospels where Jesus talks about the lamb and He goes and turns over tables because he's so disgusted with what they're doing to people. This is Matthew's people. This is his family, an extended family. And you know what's really interesting? Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, uses the word hypocrite and hypocritical words more than the rest of the New Testament combined. I think Matthew is an honest man, and that's what got him to where he is. Because he grows up in hypocrisy, in theft, in religious oppression, in the emptiness of false religion. And at some point he says, I'm not going to be dishonest in my thievery, in my crookedness. I'm out of here. I'll make my money the honest, dishonest way. I don't know about what some of you guys, I know your background, but I don't know if you've run into false religion before, empty religion before, hypocritical religion before. You're presented with a choice. Go along with it. Continue and join in faking. If you're a leader, join in taking advantage of people. Or run away. And with many people, it gives people a terrible impression of God. With honest people who see, you guys are just a bunch of fakers. You guys are just a bunch of thieves. Why would I ever do that? It's a familiar passage, but Matthew gets to write in Matthew 23, starting in verse 13. The entire chapter is the woes. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. If you go through the chapter, it's woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. These are his people. These are the people he would have grown up with. And this is the hypocrisy, the phoniness that he is fleeing, I think, that gets him to sitting in a position where everybody thinks that he is a thief and an idolater. At least that's honest, right? But here's the great thing, and this is the wonderful thing about Jesus, really. Because Jesus doesn't leave him there. Jesus doesn't say, you blew it. You gave up your birthright. You're supposed to be in Jerusalem. You're supposed to be Levi, the Levite. It doesn't matter how far he goes. Jesus doesn't leave him there. He's the good shepherd, right? He leaves the 99 to find the one. Jesus is just as disgusted with fake religion as Matthew. It's Jesus that is speaking when Matthew is penning the words, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. If you guys have had a bad experience with religion, so did Jesus. If you've experienced empty religion, so did Jesus. So did Matthew. But look what he does. And it's so great and it's so gentle, because it doesn't just happen that Jesus shows up and Matthew gets up. I mean, that's what's recorded. But if you look at what's going on around him, Matthew runs to the furthest place away from Jerusalem to get away from God. Where does God set up his headquarters? God as man when he arrives. Right next to Matthew. In the same region. Where's the Sermon on the Mount? Right down the road. Jesus is healing people left and right around him, while Matthew is sitting there counting the taxes. So Galilee of the Gentiles is the region. And in Galilee of the Gentiles, the man who is counting taxes, people traveling over roads, starts counting. There's so many more people coming. Why are all these people, thousands and thousands of people, coming into Galilee? Because Jesus is here. The tax collector is at the center of the community, keeping track of everything. So do you think he hears, hey, the leper just got healed? Then he sees the leper come along. Do you think a man who experienced false religion, who experienced hypocrisy, is impacted when a leper who religion, the religious elite, are disgusted with, will have nothing to do with? Jesus heals that man in the same area. Do you think he's affected when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount? It's right in the same area. And Matthew hears the rules of the kingdom actually laid out for the poor in heart or poor in spirit. It's not about the high priest. It's not about the fancy people. It's about the ones down here. Jesus sends messages in so many different ways from the people to get ready for this moment, Matthew's moment. It doesn't matter how far Matthew has fallen. Jesus is still chasing after him and sending messages to him and sending people to him to get him to come back to him, to get Matthew to come back to him. Jesus says, all right, you're disgusted with phony religion. So am I. But I'm not phony religion. You're disgusted with people stealing from the weak and the poor. I value the weak and the poor. And I give, and I give, and I give. I honestly, in my experience as a person who experienced religion in a less than ideal setting, I wouldn't say false religion, it was just not as it should be, as a non-believer. I just looked at it and said, this doesn't make any sense. People whose religion were defined by how miserable they can be and what big buildings they could build. I wanted to have nothing to do with it. They were making lots of money, and they were putting out lots of press releases. But the power of God just wasn't there. And I didn't meet Jesus personally, but my life changed when I began to meet people, individual people who were living out the true gospel of Jesus Christ. It didn't matter how powerful the previous organization was, what they were doing, the campaigns they were putting on, it still seemed completely empty. And then one person loving like Jesus did, one person preaching the gospel like Jesus did, one person caring about me unselfishly. The contrast was mind-blowing. So this is what sets up Matthew. He's got Jesus all around him and the testimony of Jesus all around him. So that when Jesus finally shows up in person, and says, "Follow me," nothing else makes sense. He's seen the power of Jesus on display, the love of Jesus, people being changed. Then he himself sees Jesus, and from the Luke account, it's Luke chapter 5, verse 28, it puts it, "So he left all, rose up, and followed him." Isn't that a great breaking down our life? Matthew was sitting at the table, probably with money piled up before him. And pay attention to what it says. He left all first, and then he rose up. So he's still sitting at the table. He hasn't moved physically, but he left all. That's the Greek word metanoia. It's a change of heart, change of mind leading to a change of heart, which leads to a change in behavior. He rose up and he followed Jesus. Matthew sees that his life was worthless. His pursuit, his trying to fill the holes in his life with money. He left all. He realizes that is just sin, and that is just pointless. And mentally and with his heart makes the break. And then he gets up and walks after Jesus. There are many of us who do that in kind of the wrong direction, the wrong order, where we hold on to all, we get up and we try to follow Jesus. Where we have our dreams and our hopes and our plans from before. And we have a real experience with Jesus, but we say, "Okay, Jesus, I'm going to follow after you, but let me grab all this and carry it after me." And all this stuff that I planned when I was an unbeliever, all this stuff that I want for my life, let me lift it up and drag it after you. When I was a kid, we used to have a sunfish, which was a little sailboat. It's only about like that wide, but it was super fun to go out and sail. But in the middle of the thing, to make it be able to go straight, you had a center board, and when you started off, you put it down, and it's basically a keel, so that you'd be able to go straight because the wind is pushing on you to the side. We would always forget to take it out when we'd be getting close to shallow ground. So you'd be sailing along, and you forget the center board's down there, and all of a sudden you'd start going, because it get caught in the sand. For a little while you wouldn't realize, because it's getting shallower and shallower, so you start slowing down. And then it would catch, and the whole boat would go. That's kind of like our life in Jesus. If we are dragging stuff from before along with us, whether it's my plan for life, my career, whether it's my plan for marriage or relationships, whether it's my rights, that I feel that I'm absolutely entitled to this, they start to catch. Jesus is so good to us. He's so gentle that he doesn't just say, drop all that, you're bad. He allows the resistance to start to come. And we feel the resistance. And most of us, or maybe if you're just like me, you just push through. And then you push through some more. And you ignore the resistance and you ignore the messages from God. And pretty soon you're face planting and saying, why did this just happen? Because we haven't left all. Because holding on to that stuff is bad for us. In the long run, it's bad for us. And he wants us to just let it go. The immediate pain of face planting, of coming up against the fact that we're holding on to something, is much less than the next 20 years heading in the wrong direction. Matthew, because he's had such a dramatic realization, because he has seen so bad, so empty, so lost, and has been so lost. Now he sees Jesus and he's just like, I'm done. Let's go. And he arose and follows Jesus. Verse 10 says, now it happened as Jesus sat at the table, in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? When Jesus heard that, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Okay, I want to say honestly, during my first years as a Christian, I had a problem with this idea. I thought, how is this fair? Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, which it's many people think this is Matthew's going away party, that he's gotten up from the table, that he's celebrating being released from this bondage, and that he's calling the people that he's previously been working with to come and meet the man who has set him free, Jesus. But this outrages the Pharisees. This outrages the quote-unquote good people. But much like the parable of the prodigal son, it bothered me for years. What about the good people? He hasn't come for the righteous people? I don't get it, Lord. You just came for the sinners? What about me? You didn't come for me? But who is a righteous person? Who is not a sinner? For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Who has fallen short of the glory of God? Is it some have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God? All have sinned. He's making a point to them that they're completely missing. There's no such thing as a righteous man compared to Jesus. There's no such thing as a person who's not a sinner. Every single person on earth at that point needed a physician, and that's who Jesus came for. Every single person going back and going forward through all of history is a sinner and needs the physician. We're all sick. And Jesus offers us mercy. And this outrages the people who don't see their own sin. I know we've talked about Adoniram Judson before. He's a missionary to Burma. And he's an amazing man of God. When he started off, his father wanted him to be a church man. He wanted him to have a fancy church in New England so that he could support him. He wanted him to be famous. He wanted to be on TV, asking for donations, sending out miracle cloths. And Adoniram Judson, who later goes to Burma and spends 40 years working for God with no discernible results, and is still praising Jesus at the end of that, you know what he does? He's just like Matthew. He takes off. He's on his way to New York City for Wine, Women, and Song, believing that God is just a general cosmic force and the Bible is not true. He learned this in college from a good friend who seemed intelligent and wise and worldly. And he stops for the night at a hotel. And as he's trying to go to sleep, he hears the man in the room next to him in incredible pain, crying out in misery. And he realizes this man in the room next to me is dying. On the run from fake religion, from a man, his dad trying to get him to build his own kingdom. He comes face to face with the fact that death is real. I'm going to have to face God, and I'm not ready. I'm a sinner, and I need the physician. So he spends the night listening to the guy, and he's just racked with pain and guilt and trying to work it out with God. And he goes to the front desk and asks him, what happened to the guy next to me? He said, oh, it's terrible, he died. I said, do you know his name? It was Jacob Eames, which was his friend from college who convinced him that God did not exist. At that moment, he cried out to the physician, the one who offered salvation to even sinners like him. And 40 years of service to God was a blessing, was a gift in light of that realization. He was running from God, and God tracked him down. Look, I know that I don't know if anybody here is running from God. That's something in your hearts. If you are, God's going to come after you. You can't get away. It's better just to stop now and experience the joy of being healed by the great physician. But even better, just knowing you guys, if there are people in your life who are running, who are battling with all their heart, Jesus is still working. He's sending stuff from all over the place. From friends, from TV, from things you see. He's sending hard things to break down the resistance in their lives, to get them to realize that they need the physician. And then he's sending mercy and grace and sending love and people who just are on fire for Jesus. No one's too far. God still has them in that person in his sights. And having been a person who lived a good portion of my life unsaved, I'd urge you, just, if you don't feel qualified, if you don't feel like you're making a difference, that's just from Satan. Live on fire for Jesus, loving people, caring about people, just being you in Jesus, and it makes a huge difference. It's how the Roman Empire changed into the Christian empire. Just a handful of people starting off, living for Jesus, telling people about what they did, what Jesus did for them. This world out there looks crazy. It's looking crazier every day. But Jesus is still in charge. And he's given us the power and ability to change everything by just authentically walking after him. Are we willing to do it? If you're trying to do it and there's that running board, you're feeling the resistance, I'd urge you just to let it go today. If you're picking up your own burdens and making your own life in Christ hard, life's hard enough without putting it on ourselves. Let them down today. Let them go. And praise the great physician for doing that, for making it possible. Just want to make one last point because it just occurred to me. There's a cultural narrative about this section that Jesus is more comfortable with the sinners. So therefore, we should be comfortable with sinners and we should accept sinners where they are. In some ways, it's true. We're sinners. They're sinners. Everyone is on a journey with Christ. But why is Jesus at this gathering? It's not because he enjoys the company of tax collectors. He says it himself. He's a physician. He's there for those who are sick. So he doesn't approve of people who are openly sinning. He's a doctor there to heal them, not to just hang out with them. I don't know about you, but my doctor doesn't want to come into the examining room and hang out with me. He wants to figure out what's wrong, diagnose me, and get out of there. Jesus is way better than that, but the picture is his mission is to heal us, not to pat us on our head and say, good job for being a sinner. All right, sorry. So anyway, we will stop there.